Hello. Before we dive in this week, I'd like to talk for a moment about this word prophet. You may have noticed that this week's episode is called Prophets in Our Midst, and I'd like to clear up some confusion about the word. For you see, in recent times, the word has come to be used to describe someone who can peer into the future and perhaps make predictions about the future. Think soothsayer, think crystal ball. And this is unfortunate because in the biblical world, this word seldom means this. I want to add, if ever. It's debatable, but it hardly ever does mean something like that. In the Bible, a prophet almost always is someone who can accurately and sagely and in wisdom and with insight describe their current circumstance, an inspired teacher perhaps, or a preacher who can proclaim the will of God to a people in a specific time and in a specific place. So the prophet would look at a cultural landscape, say the Roman Empire or during the Persian occupation, and proclaim the system's unjust or greedy or violent, and then describe what sort of transformation needs to occur for that culture to conform to life-giving ways. And this will be the sense in which we talk about the word prophet, or who a prophet is, throughout this week's message. One who truthfully and in wisdom calls it like it is and then describes things as they ought to be. So keep that in mind as we proceed. We'll begin by reading Mark chapter 6, verses 1 through 6. And we will touch on some of the verses that come later in a bit, but we won't be reading from those just now. The text goes, "He left that place and came to his hometown, and his disciples followed him. On the Sabbath, he began to teach in the synagogue, and many who heard him were astounded. They said, 'Where did this man get all this? What is this wisdom that has been given to him? What deeds of power are being done by his hands? Is this not the carpenter, the son of Mary, the brother of James and Joseph and Judas and Simon? And are not his sisters here with us?' And they took offense at him. Then Jesus said to them, 'Prophets are not without honor except in their hometown and among their own kin and in their own house.' And he could do no deed of power there except that he laid his hands on a few sick people and cured them. And he was amazed at their unbelief." This passage took me for a ride this week. Don't get me wrong, it certainly will preach. This passage, after all, contains that iconic line, "A prophet is not without honor in his hometown." In other words, the people who know you best are the least apt to see the wisdom and insights that you have to offer, the truth that you have to speak. And if we could read further, we will find that in the very next scene, Jesus sends out his disciples in groups of two and instructs them on how to handle themselves should they face similar rejection in the places that they go. And his advice is this: pack light so you can move quickly. And if you are not welcomed, clean the dust from the shoes of your feet, the dust from that town, so that none of its taint will go with you. And these passages, for many, are easily relatable because we all have our stories of perceived slights and persecution. So as I said, this usually will preach, but oftentimes from the vantage point of the first person, which maybe isn't such a good idea, an idea we'll explore as we go forward. After all, I can remember coming back from my childhood church after my first year away at college, and I was even training to be a minister at the time, and I had learned a thing or two, so I had arranged to return home as a student minister. I loved the title, and that role was one in which I was to lead the youth and to assist the pastor. I was even tasked with teaching an adult Sunday school class, people twice my age, in fact. So I thought that I would wow them with my newfound knowledge, and I thought that I'd challenge them and correct their folksy, colloquial, quaint understanding of the scriptures and church history. In short, I was an arrogant young fool and was received as such and for my own good. But do you know what I called it then? I called it persecution. I thought of myself as a prophet without honor in my own town at my home church, and it was cathartic to wipe the dust off my shoes and return to college for my sophomore year. This Messiah complex, and I will call it that because that's what it was and sometimes still is, it doesn't leave us overnight. So in my first years of pastoring, now a college graduate with a degree in Christian ministries under my belt, I thought that I was about to reinvent the local church. I had ideas, I had passion, I had answers to life's problems, I thought. And rest assured, I let everyone know about it. I preached impassioned sermons calculated to convict and move hearts. I preached as one who knew that he had seen the face of God and was tasked with describing what I'd seen to a group of people who couldn't possibly understand. And when I was met with criticism of my style, or when I was met with resistance to my ideas, again, persecution, a prophet without honor in my new hometown. This was, I explained to myself, why nothing I tried seemed to work. After all, Jesus could perform no deed of power except heal a few sick people, and I reasoned if Jesus was hamstrung by the lack of faith in his hometown, why not me? So I lamented their lack of faith, the lack of faith I saw in others, and in doing so, I felt a little better, my insecurities assuaged. Well, about 4 years ago, I left that church after serving there for 10 years, so I knew that there was very little chance for me to preach this passage in my new church without leaning pretty hard into that bit about dusting off my shoes and leaving the past in the past, with my experiences there in mind, until I develop new experiences in my new context. And so where does it end? At what point do I refocus my attention away from myself and stop seeing myself as the prophet in the story, the prophet who is rejected? We often want to air the laundry, tell of our hurt, and describe the dirt that we've been trying to brush off our shoes until we realize that maybe these passages aren't meant to be taken as autobiographical. Maybe we aren't meant to see ourselves as the prophet. You know, all of this is what happens when you identify as the prophet in your own story, the mover, the shaker, the mouthpiece of God. But at one point, it has to hit you. How if we perform a little thought experiment? How if for a few minutes we choose to consider that maybe we aren't the primary prophet in our story? How if we for a moment try to see ourselves as one of Jesus' neighbors, or perhaps as his brother or sister? How if we can find the courage to demote ourselves to a fly on the wall and ask ourselves, who really is the prophet in my story? And what if we've been missing the prophets right under our noses this entire time? What if we are missing the prophets in our midst as Jesus' friends and neighbors and family members did in his time? So when I performed this little thought experiment, took myself out of the center of the story, everything changed. When you are able to shift the focus away from yourself for a moment or two, which is a hard thing to do in our narcissistic culture of selfies and self-promotion, when you do this, you begin to notice that things aren't as you had thought. You begin to notice things that you hadn't noticed before. I began to wonder what prophets from my hometowns I may have failed to notice or put my faith in. After all, are we not the body of Christ, and are not disciples of Jesus living embodiments of Jesus in the world? Aren't we supposed to see Jesus in our neighbor and in our friend, in our colleagues, in our family members? What we should never forget is what happened next in the story. Jesus sends out his disciples with his authority and power, and they wielded it, and they healed, and they cast out demons, and then they were rejected in various places because people could not see those common fishermen as prophets. The text reads that Jesus' ability to do deeds of power was diminished because of their unbelief, and then conversely, their disciples' ability. And I began to wonder about my own unbelief in regards to other potential prophets. If only I could be amazed at my unbelief rather than complacent in it. How if there is a prophet sitting next to you at work, or in the pew at church, or in your very house around the dinner table if you had the eyes to see? How many people have we overlooked because we've been so focused on our own perceived slights or insights? And in what ways have we snubbed them and ignored their voices, their prophetic voices? This line of reasoning forces us to consider who the prophets may be in our own hometowns. Who are the prophets the reflections of God that we have failed to see or believe in? As I pondered this question, I was reminded of a man that I knew at my last church. His name was Marvin, and Marvin was a farmer, a good old boy who wore plaid denims and a wide-brimmed hat. And he was a simple, humble, joyful, but quieter man. And he and his wife, Marie, just were the cutest couple that you ever did see in their old age. And no one was about to mistake Marvin for a prophet, not by a long shot, because he was far too folksy and familiar. Well, when he died, his children told me a story about their dad. You see, Marvin once leased a piece of farm equipment to a neighbor, and I forget the details exactly, but it was something like this. The neighbor was to pay Marvin back at the end of the harvest, and I think that Marvin even helped the neighbor in the fields. So when the time came and the harvest was in, the man told Marvin bluntly that he wasn't going to pay him back what he owed. Simple as that. And Marvin's children, his adult children at that time, were furious. They told their dad that he ought to ruin the man's name, that he ought to go over to his neighbor's house and give him a piece of his mind. His children said that their father sat back and said, "No, I'm not going to do any of those things." And his children asked, "Well, why not?" Reasonable question. He would be within his rights. And to that question, Marvin replied, "Because if he can live with it, I can live without it." Marvin was a prophet without nearly enough honor in his hometown. His children could not see it then, but they see it now, which is why they told me the story. And I wonder what other miraculous words and deeds that have been missed out on because we cannot see the prophets in our midst, those wise words, those keen insights. I wonder how many other prophets have sat in my sanctuary each Sunday as their pastor that I could not see because I could not believe in their potential power, latent or perhaps obvious, in the persons who sat in the pews in front of me or shared in our communion. But it gets more surprising and sneakier than that, this business of prophets being right under your nose. A few years ago, I visited some relatives on the 4th of July, and my cousin told me a story about her daughter. They had found a dead rabbit in their backyard. And her daughter insisted that they give the rabbit a proper burial. I don't know if you've had a child who has done likewise, or perhaps you as a child or as an adult thought, let's give this wild animal a proper burial. She was maybe 8 years old, and her mother thought to herself, it's just a rabbit, come on. But she jumped through the hoops, and at some point during the proceedings, her daughter said, "Mommy, we have to remember this rabbit. We can't ever forget it." And Mom asked, "But why?" And her daughter said, "Because God made all the creatures, and they are all important to Jesus." Pint-sized prophet. A prophet in miniature who, in the words of the poet Rumi, is small in size but sees enormous things. So who else? Who else is a prophet without honor in our midst? Who aren't we noticing or believing in? And whose full potential and worth are being overlooked because of our unbelief? Sometimes all that's needed is for someone to notice the power of God that is in someone else, and then they are empowered and transformed before our eyes to do all that they can. Jesus did this when he sent out his disciples. The text reads that he gave them authority over unclean spirits, if you read on to the next verse in verse 7. Jesus noticed the prophets around him, or the potential prophets in the disciples, and sent them out with the power of God to do amazing things. And so my question today in the 21st century is, who else? Possibly you. Definitely the children. Almost certainly someone you've never taken very seriously. When Jesus said to them, prophets are not without honor except in their hometown and among their own kin and in their own house. And he could do no deed of power at, say, Northwood or in Indianapolis and many other places besides because of their lack of belief. In what ways do we stifle the power of God because we fail to notice the prophets in our own hometown and fail to believe in them? What prophets have been placed near you, voices speaking truth and wisdom that you have heretofore missed? A preacher willing to name uncomfortable truths in our times, perhaps? But you know what? That would be too obvious and too easy. Perhaps, rather, in the form of a child or of an activist, one who advocates for the poor and the marginalized and the destitute. Their faces and shapes are numerous, and if we are wise, we'll open our eyes to see and the ears to hear the prophets in our midst.